Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive deep into the journeys of resilience, healing, and self-discovery. Today's story follows a young woman, Sophia, who, after years of emotional mistreatment by her own family, finds the courage to break free and reclaim her voice. With the help of her uncle Richard, she embarks on a path of personal growth, therapy, and writing, slowly shedding the weight of her past to embrace a future of freedom and self-acceptance. Subscribe to the channel to start today's story, filled with powerful lessons on strength, forgiveness, and transformation. The living room buzzed with the usual forced laughter and chatter of my relatives. But it felt like the world was closing in on me. My heart pounded in my chest, drowning out the noise around me. I could barely hear my father's voice as it sliced through the air with the sharpness of a whip. "Sophia, stand up," he barked. All eyes turned to me. My face burned with humiliation as I reluctantly rose from my seat, unsure of what I had done this time. My parents didn't need much of an excuse to make me their scapegoat. It could be anything: a wrong look, a misplaced comment, or in this case, my harmless prank at dinner, a fake inheritance check I had thought would bring a little laughter to the table. But instead of laughter, the room had fallen into silence before my father's anger erupted. "You thought that was funny?" he demanded, his face red with rage. His voice trembled with fury as he pointed at me, his words cutting through the still air. "Embarrassing us like that in front of the whole family. I didn't mean to, it was just a joke," I stammered, my voice trembling. I could feel my knees weaken beneath me, but I had to stand. I couldn't let them see how much this hurt. I had learned long ago not to cry in front of them. "You didn't mean to," my mother interjected sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Do you think this family is a joke, Sophia?" Before I could say anything, my father grabbed a length of cord from the corner of the room. My stomach dropped, a cold feeling spreading through me as I realized what was happening. He stormed toward me with the cord in his hand, and my breath hitched in my throat. "Sit down," he shouted, pointing at a chair in the middle of the room. Humiliated beyond belief, I sank into the chair. My wrists were bound tightly with the rope, cutting into my skin, and I bit my lip to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. The laughter and murmurs from the relatives swirled around me, but I barely heard them. The voices of my parents continued to blur into the background as they continued to berate me for the prank, each word adding to the weight on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I wanted was for the ground to swallow me whole. And then, the door slammed open. The sharp sound cut through the chaos, and for a brief moment, I thought everything would stop. All eyes turned toward the doorway. Standing there, framed by the light of the hallway, was a man I hadn't seen in years. My uncle Richard. He was dressed in a tailored suit, looking like he belonged in a world far removed from the dysfunction of our family. His presence was commanding, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room and lingering on me, taking in the sight of the ropes binding my wrists. The room fell silent. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. My father faltered for a moment, caught off guard. For the first time in years, I saw him hesitate. Richard's gaze didn't leave my parents. "Richard, this doesn't concern you," my father said, his voice tight. Richard stepped into the room, his posture straight and unyielding. "It does now," he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. The tension in the room was suffocating as Richard strode toward me, his steps deliberate and calm. He crouched in front of me, his expression softening. "Are you okay, Sophie?" His words were gentle, the kind of warmth I had never known from my parents. I nodded, though my throat was tight, the tears threatening to spill over. But this time, I didn't feel alone. Richard turned to face my parents, his anger barely contained but his voice steady. "Untie her," he said firmly. "This is discipline," my mother argued, her voice rising in defense. "She needs to learn discipline." Richard's voice rose slightly, his fury slipping through. "This isn't discipline," he said. His words cold and unyielding. "This is cruelty." My father hesitated, stumbling over his words as Richard's glare bore down on him. Finally, my father gave in, the tension in his shoulders melting as he loosened the ropes around my wrists. The ropes fell away, and I rubbed my arms, the marks from the cord already red and sore against my skin. Richard turned to me. "Go pack your things." I froze for a moment. "What?" My mother's voice was filled with disbelief. "You can't just take her." "Oh, I can," Richard said, his tone icy. "And I will. You've proven you don't deserve her." My father began to speak, but Richard cut him off. "No, Peter. I understand perfectly. I've watched you and Amanda tear her down for years. That ends today." My parents exchanged a panicked look, knowing they couldn't challenge Richard. His wealth and influence far outweighed theirs, and they depended on him too much to risk alienating him completely. "This is a mistake," my mother hissed, her face twisted in anger. "The only mistake," Richard said, his voice calm but firm, "is the way you've treated your daughter." He turned back to me, his expression softening once again. "You're coming with me. You don't belong here." I followed Richard out of the house, my steps hesitant at first, then quicker as the weight of the room behind me lifted. The cool night air hit my face like a breath of freedom. Richard's sleek black car waited in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He opened the passenger door for me, and I slid into the seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind us, my parents stood on the porch, my mother's face twisted in fury while my father stood, stunned, his usual bravado stripped away. Liam peeked out from behind them, his smirk gone, replaced by something that almost looked like regret. Richard climbed into the driver's seat, and the car roared to life. The sound drowned out the murmurs from the porch as we pulled away. I glanced back once, just once, to see my mother's silhouette shrinking into the distance. Then, they were gone. "You don't need to look back anymore," Richard said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the road. "You're free now." As we drove, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally being rescued, not just physically, but emotionally. Richard had become the protector I had never known I needed. It was strange, this feeling of being safe, but it was also a feeling I wasn't sure how to embrace. We didn't speak much during the drive, but the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a shared understanding, like we both knew that this was the beginning of something new for me, a chance to breathe, to be who I was, to have the space to heal. When we arrived at Richard's home, the contrast to my own house was immediate and jarring. It felt like I was stepping into a different reality, one that I had never even imagined. The house stood tall and majestic, surrounded by manicured gardens that stretched out into the distance, as if this space was built to hold something much larger than a simple family. The architecture was sleek, modern, and gleaming in the moonlight, almost as though it were an artwork in itself. It didn't feel cold or imposing, though. It was warm, inviting, and seemed alive. As Richard led me inside, I felt like I was walking into a sanctuary. The interior was breathtaking: high ceilings, polished floors, walls lined with bookshelves, and art that made each room feel full of life. But more than the grandeur, the house exuded a sense of calm that I had never known. There was no tension in the air, no angry whispers or strained conversations. "This is your home now," Richard said as he unlocked the front door and gestured for me to enter. The weight of his words didn't fully hit me until I stepped inside. For the first time in years, I could feel my body relax. I didn't have to hide, didn't have to shrink myself. Here, I was allowed to exist. Richard led me through the house, showing me the spacious living room, the study with walls of books, and finally upstairs to my guest room. The room was larger than I had imagined. A soft bed stood in the middle, surrounded by a desk by the window, with a view of the sprawling gardens below. The light coming through the windows in the early morning made everything glow in soft, golden hues. It was peaceful. Almost like the world outside didn't exist in this place. I sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling a wave of exhaustion hit me. "Take your time settling in," Richard said, his voice gentle. "We'll talk in the morning." He left me there, and for a moment, I just sat in the stillness. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, the humiliation, the anger, the way my parents had treated me. It all felt like a blur now, and yet I could still feel the tightness in my chest from the way they had spoken to me. But the longer I sat in Richard's home, the more I could feel the walls around me start to loosen. It wasn't immediate, but there was a sense of calm here that allowed me to breathe more easily. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the tension of the past years still gnawing at me, but I eventually drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams filled with flashes of my parents' faces, of their disappointment and anger. In the morning, though, the golden light pouring through the windows seemed to wash away some of that heaviness. When I walked into the dining room the next morning, Richard was already seated at the long table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up when he saw me, and a warm smile spread across his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft, full of warmth. "Did you sleep well?" I nodded, though I knew the sleep had been fitful. "Thank you for everything." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "You don't have to thank me, Sophia. What they did to you was wrong. It's my job to make sure you're safe now." There was something about the way he said it that made me believe him. It wasn't just about keeping me physically safe, it was about protecting me emotionally. Something my parents had never done. I sat down at the table, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being treated as a person, not a disappointment, not a burden. As we ate, Richard began to ask me gentle questions, not the kind that made me feel like I was on trial, but questions that made me feel like he genuinely wanted to understand me. He asked about my interests, my dreams, the things I had never been allowed to explore because my parents had always told me what I should love, what I should do, and who I should be. "So, what do you love?" Richard asked, his voice quiet but sincere. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. My whole life had been a blur of doing things for the sake of pleasing others. But something in his tone made me realize that I didn't need to pretend here. I used to love writing," I said hesitantly, the words surprising even myself. "When I was younger, I would write stories all the time. But my parents always told me it was a waste of time. I gave it up." Richard's expression darkened, but his voice remained calm. "They were wrong, Sophia. If writing makes you happy, you should do it." His words held a weight that I wasn't prepared for. He wasn't just telling me it was okay, he was telling me that it was necessary. For the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't as lost as I thought I was. Maybe I could find my way again. A few days passed, and Richard continued to support me in ways that were both gentle and persistent. He didn't push me, but he always made sure I knew that I was allowed to be myself here, that I didn't have to be what others wanted me to be. He arranged for me to see Dr. Elena Carter, a therapist he trusted. At first, the idea of therapy seemed strange to me. My parents had always dismissed mental health as a luxury for the weak. But Richard was different. His quiet insistence that I see someone about what I was going through made me feel like it was okay to ask for help. Dr. Carter's office was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't sterile or intimidating, it was warm and inviting. The first time I sat down with her, I was surprised at how easily I could talk. She didn't rush me, didn't make me feel like I was wasting her time. She just listened. And it was enough. "I've always felt like I wasn't enough," I admitted quietly, almost afraid of the truth behind my own words. No matter what I did, it was never good enough for them. Dr. Carter nodded, Her expression understanding. That's a heavy burden to carry, Sophia. But it's not yours to bear. Their treatment of you says more about them than it does about you. Her words stuck with me long after I left her office that day. It was the first time I had heard someone tell me that I didn't have to carry the weight of their expectations. And slowly, I began to believe it. Back at Richard's, things began to shift inside me. I found myself sitting at the desk in my room, pulling out a notebook and pen, not sure what to write at first, but feeling the need to write, to express something, anything that was my own. The first words came slowly, painfully even, but soon, they began to flow. Writing became a way to reclaim my voice, a way to deal with all the emotions I had stuffed down for so long. And with each word I wrote, I felt a little more like myself again. The days that followed in Richard's home were a mix of quiet healing and growing self-discovery. For the first time, I wasn't just existing, I was beginning to live in a way that felt real. I was allowed to do things for myself, to explore who I was without the weight of my parents' expectations bearing down on me. Each new day felt like another chance to breathe, to rediscover parts of myself that had been silenced for years. Richard was patient with me, always offering support, never rushing me to confront anything I wasn't ready to face. One evening, as I sat at the desk in my room, staring at the notebook in front of me, Richard knocked gently on the door and stepped in. "How's the writing coming along?" he asked, his voice soft, not pushing me but genuinely curious. I smiled slightly. "Better than I expected. Actually, it's been hard. But it feels good. I'm starting to say things I've been keeping inside for so long." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, watching me. "That's the beauty of writing, Sophie. It gives you a voice, even when it feels like no one's listening." His words struck a chord deep within me. I had always felt invisible, like my voice didn't matter, like I wasn't enough. But now, with each page I filled, I felt a little less invisible. Writing wasn't just an escape, it was a way to process everything I had been through. It became my sanctuary. One afternoon, after a therapy session with Dr. Carter, I returned home to find Richard waiting for me in the living room. He looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious. "You've been through a lot, Sophie. More than anyone should have to. And I want you to consider therapy more seriously. It might help you unpack some of what you've been carrying." The idea of therapy, of diving into the depths of my emotions, terrified me. I had always been taught that showing weakness, especially in front of others, was a failure. But Richard's gentle, reassuring gaze made me feel like maybe it was worth trying. I hesitated, but Richard's presence was a constant reminder that I didn't have to face this alone. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." Richard arranged for me to see Dr. Carter more frequently. During each session, I began to unravel the tangled mess of feelings I had carried for so long. I spoke about my parents, their constant criticism, the emotional distance they maintained, the way they made me feel like I was never enough. Dr. Carter listened intently, never rushing, never dismissing my feelings. Her words were like balm for wounds I hadn't even realized were still raw. As the weeks passed, I began to feel a shift within me. Therapy wasn't a magic cure, but it was helping me see the world and myself in a different light. I started to recognize that my parents' treatment of me wasn't a reflection of my worth. They had projected their own insecurities and disappointments onto me, and I had internalized it, believing their cruelty was justified. But now, with each session, I started to let go of those old beliefs. I was not their disappointment. I was not the person they had tried to make me. Writing, too, was evolving. It no longer felt like a forced escape. It became something that was deeply personal, a reflection of my journey to heal. Richard encouraged me to keep writing, to explore my thoughts and emotions in ways I had never allowed myself before. Slowly, I began to write about things I had never spoken about aloud: the isolation, the shame, the moments when I felt like I couldn't breathe. Writing gave me the courage to confront the memories I had buried deep inside. One evening, I showed Richard a short story I had written. It was about a girl who had been trapped in a tower, her life controlled by forces beyond her control, until one day she broke free. As I handed him the pages, my hands trembled slightly, unsure of what he would think. Richard read it carefully, his eyes scanning each word. When he finished, he looked up at me, his expression thoughtful. Then, a proud smile spread across his face. "This is incredible, Sophia," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You have a gift. You should be proud of what you've written." For the first time in my life, I felt a flicker of pride in myself. I had always doubted my abilities, dismissed my own dreams as foolish. But Richard's words made me realize that I had a talent, something that was mine. It was a moment of realization that, despite everything I had been through, I was more than just the girl my parents had tried to break. I was someone with dreams, with a voice, with a future. As the days passed, I continued to write, slowly building the foundation of something that felt meaningful. Richard's encouragement never wavered. He set up a small writing nook for me in my room, complete with a new laptop and shelves stocked with books on storytelling and creativity. "Consider this your space," he said. "No pressure. Just write what feels right." With each passing day, the words became easier to find. I began to write stories about strength, about survival, about reclaiming a sense of self. Every page I filled was a step forward, a step away from the past that had tried to define me. Richard was always there, a steady presence in my life. He never pushed me to go faster, to do more than I was ready for. But he made it clear that my journey was worth it, that I was worth it. As my confidence grew, Richard suggested that I enter a local writing competition. At first, the idea terrified me. What if I wasn't good enough? What if I failed? But Richard's unwavering belief in me pushed me to take the leap. "You can do this," he said, his eyes filled with conviction. "You're ready." I submitted my story, uncertain of what would happen. But when I received the notification that I had won first place, I couldn't believe it. The prize wasn't just a cash award, it was the validation I had never received from my parents. For the first time, I felt like I had proven something for myself. I was good at this. That night, as I stood at the award ceremony and accepted the trophy, Richard stood beside me, his smile wide with pride. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing tall, not just for myself, but for the person I had become. As the months passed, I continued to find strength in my writing. The success of the competition had opened new doors for me, but it was the journey, the healing, and the rediscovery of who I was that mattered most. With each word, I was shedding the layers of hurt, reclaiming my voice, and finally building a life that was entirely my own. Richard's support had been unwavering, and his belief in me never faltered. Together, we had created something new, a family not bound by blood, but by love, respect, and understanding. It was a family I had never known but always longed for. Looking back, I realized that my past, though painful, had shaped me into the person I was meant to be. It had taught me resilience, the importance of self-love, and the power of finding your own path. The chains that once bound me were gone, replaced by the freedom to live authentically. This was just the beginning, the first chapter of a story I was writing for myself, and I was ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow new life stories and more inspiring journeys.